What's up, everybody? Welcome
What's
back.
up, Coach TJ?
Zoe.
We're back in less than a week. We did it. We turned things around and we're getting a podcast out on time.
Love it.
So we're covering quite a few topics today. We're going to dive into some hot or not, your fave. We're also going to get into a primer on what new ultrarunners can reasonably expect in their first year. And we're going to get super nerdy about why ultrarunners still need to focus on developing their VO2 Max. And we're going to look at a study that shows how hill intervals are particularly helpful with that. So the science of hill strides, why they work, and why athletes, no matter how far you're running, should still be working on developing speed via VO2 Max.
VO2 Max. Steve Magnus is going to have a field day with this.
I hope so. It's a tough, and we'll talk about this later, but I feel like VO2 Max sort of has recently gotten overhyped.
It feels hacky.
It feels hacky. It feels like, we saw a lot of influencers saying, like, if you increase your VO2 Max, you increase your longevity and overall health. And it's kind of more of a proxy for those things. It's not like a direct measurement of that. It's not even the most accurate assessment of like your fitness or running performance. It is definitely a big factor in that.
Or running potential.
And it is something we do want to directly improve. We don't want to obsess about it. It's not the only factor, but it is a really important factor. So we're going to get into that later. And again, why, even if you're running UTMB, you should still be thinking about your VO2 Max.
All right, we'll get into it. Let's start with some hot or not, though.
Yeah. Hot or not, Coach TJ, NSAIDs.
Oh.
Like ibuprofen.
I know what they are.
Right.
Thank you. I'm just like, oh man, putting me on the spot here. I'm going to say not hot.
Yeah. So, I actually saw a pretty interesting study. So this is something like, as, level 1 of this, if you are taking painkillers to, or particularly anti-inflammatories, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, NSAID, that's something we want to be really careful with, and you should not use chronically in training. If you feel sore and you pop an Advil, we don't really want to do that, because reducing the inflammation actually can take away a lot of positive training adaptations, or it could mask some really important signals that your body is sending you. So we don't want to diminish training adaptations, and we don't want to paper over pain that might be telling us something useful.
We have inflammation for a reason.
So there actually was a study. So another thing is these are banned in competition use for, events like UTMB. So be aware of that. And athletes always have to be diligent in making sure that they're not using banned substances. The onus is on the athlete to do that research as of now. And as a coach, I always try to work with athletes on that as well.
Absolutely.
Because there have been concerns that NSAIDs can lead to renal failure and kidney damage if used in ultramarathons. There was actually a study done where it didn't find a very positive correlation between NSAID use and kidney damage in the acute sense. However, there was definitely nothing in the study that suggested that using them was positive or led to better outcomes. So given that we know that they can, in a non-ultra running context, lead to kidney damage, I'm still going to say don't use these while you're running. Don't use them in training. If you feel that you do need to use them, that probably means you need to take a step back in your training.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I think that there's a lot of athletes out there who tend to
overuse vitamin I.
Vitamin I. I forgot about that expression. Yeah, I think a lot of folks too who maybe are about my age, 37, kind of like are used to just like being told by athletic trainers in high school and college, like
I sit and take an Advil.
Right. And it's, they kind of carry that with them into these sports where like probably we're training more than we were in college, training definitely more than in high school, where like the potential of long-term use of these things is maybe the potential for damage there with long-term use is maybe heightened. So I always, when I have athletes who are asking me about this, I'm always like, talk to your doctor. Talk to your PT. I know my PT is like, maybe in 6 years working with her, she's told me like to try to use NSAIDs one time.
Yeah, they can, again, talk to your doctor. They can be useful in knocking down acute inflammation, and there can be times where that's useful, like if there's like an acute injury situation.
Right.
But again, this is not something that we want to be like using with any kind of regularity.
With reckless abandon.
No pill popping with reckless. There's very few things we reckless abandon, maybe sleep with reckless abandon are the only things that you should do recklessly abandonly.
I definitely took some ibuprofen after Western States a few days after my back started acting up.
Yeah.
And I couldn't sleep. And I was like, is it bad that I took 4? And you were like, yes. And I was like, I feel like I remember as a kid I would be taking 4, 6. I feel like it was so liberal. But yeah, don't do what I do. Be very smart. Okay, 200-mile races.
I feel like we've covered this one before, but we're going to do it again because will be curious to see if either of our opinions evolve. I'm going to say like they're 200-mile. I think people should race the distance that feels exciting to them with an eye towards mastery, and that longer doesn't mean better or more badass. Running a 5K well is super badass. Running 250 miles well, super badass. I think that I am hesitant when I see more and more folks doing 200s after not having spent a ton of time in the sport because they feel like they need to go longer to like get attention and recognition. And I don't love that. I don't even think people need to run ultras. If you don't like ultras, that's very normal and healthy of you. Congratulations on being held enough as a child. Let me know how that was for you. But I don't want people to always get into this trap of doing more and going longer. Whatever distance you like to race is valid. If you like 25Ks, fuck yeah, race 25Ks.
Yeah, I agree. Like I noticed you didn't say hot and you didn't say not.
Yeah.
And I feel like
my take is that
you're supposed to have a take.
I mean, I don't personally. I feel like as soon as you're sleeping during a race, I lose interest.
Right.
I do. I like watching Cocodona. That's kind of the only one I like really pay attention to at all. I like seeing a higher level of female competition at those races. And I also like training athletes for those races, but I don't see myself doing that anytime soon. I mean, also, like, I just can't imagine asking my crew to take, like, a full week off work.
We have a no 200-mile
We do. That's actually
in
true.
house.
In our prenup, we're going to get a you can call it quits if I ask you to crew me at a 200.
Yeah, that's a non-negotiable.
So I guess that the fact that we've literally discussed that in the context of a marriage agreement should tell you how I really feel.
100 miles is enough.
It is enough. It's plenty.
But, I want to say if I have trained athletes for 200-mile races and it was an enjoyable process for me as a coach, I think it was an enjoyable process for those athletes as well. I'm here to look, objectively at what an athlete's goals are and to not bring in any of my biases. However, I will take the opportunity that this podcast provides to provide my own color.
Right,
and context
taking the
to this.
coach hat off.
Yeah, I don't think that they're hot. Again, I think that like
you're not sliding into the DMs of.
They're not hot for me. Like I want to be fast. I want to be as fast as I can be for as long as possible.
I don't want to have to miss multiple nights of sleep.
And I love trying to finish like hundreds before midnight.
Yeah.
So that way, like me and the crew can get almost 8 hours of sleep.
Yeah. Imagine pacing someone for like a full day.
I mean, it's just it's a whole nother level. And a lot of respect to those athletes. Yeah. And, they will get 100% of my support if they're looking for, coaching in that area. But for me, my sights are on different things.
That's correct, as reflected in our prenup. TJ, hot or not, the elliptical?
I am so not hot on the elliptical.
Really? I'm hot on the elliptical. Okay, tell me why.
I just
disagreement. Let's
think
go.
That I've seen a lot of stuff talked about on other podcasts about the elliptical being similar to running, and you can do strides on it and all these things, and it's like really like running, but it's not. And I'm just like, bullshit. Like, I've experimented with the elliptical. I've also prescribed it a lot to athletes who are going through injury, and the feedback that I get is this is not like running. This you can't do strides on it.
Yeah, I don't
you
recommend
could do
strides
a
on the
little effort.
elliptical.
You could do a little effort.
I'll prescribe workouts and tempo runs.
Sure, but it's not the same.
No.
And I think like I've heard that like very liberally discussed on some other podcasts that you can prescribe elliptical as a substitute for running, and I think that that's completely untrue.
I would not say the elliptical is a substitute for running. I would say it's some of the most effective low impact cross training.
I think it's very hot as a cross training tool.
Yeah, I'm talking about it like the elliptical is not the same thing as running,
but
it
not
is
if you
good
can
cross
run.
training.
Not if you can run.
Yes, if you can't run, then doing the elliptical is a great way to safely increase your volume without increasing the impact. So that's why I'm a fan of it. But don't get on the elliptical and think that it's the exact same stimulus as running.
Yeah. Okay, intermittent fasting, hot or not?
Not.
My God, I can't wait for... Can I spoil your other podcast on this?
Yeah.
I just can't wait to hear a podcast episode from Your Diet Sucks about intermittent fasting.
Yeah. So, Kylie and I have a podcast coming out called Your Diet Sucks. You can subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts and follow us on Instagram at Your Diet Sucks Pod. And we do have an episode coming out about the history of fasting. And, there was one study that I was looking at that just recently that I don't know why it popped in my head this morning as I was doing the opposite of fasting and I was break fasting. It's like break dancing, but for food. It's not. I was having breakfast. I was eating a cinnamon roll. And, I have athletes that ask a lot about intermittent fasting, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. But there was actually a really interesting new study that came out that showed that it might lead to worse cardiovascular outcomes for people who practice it. And that oftentimes if people do lose weight through intermittent fasting, they're actually just losing weight through good old-fashioned calorie restriction rather than like any sort of like actual change to the metabolism. Intermittent fasting is not consistently shown to increase your fat oxidation rate. But you know what is consistently shown to increase your fat oxidation rate? Aerobic training.
Yeah.
So if you want to have a healthier, better metabolism with a lower risk of cardiovascular injury, may I suggest consistent endurance training?
Gosh, you just served me up like
a big platter of breakfast
softball there, and I was slow on the uptake. But I feel like this is another one of those things that like I've heard talked about by runners,
all of the brothers Hemsworth,
prominent in the industry, and like with all love and light to the elliptical and intermittent fasters out there, I fundamentally disagree. Sorry. It's just not worth did you mention the risk for injury?
No.
My God.
I was only looking at studies in non-athlete individuals. So that's before we even assess, is this good for athletes? And the news does not get better from there.
So,
unless, of course, the news you're looking for is that it increases your risk of injury and can also make you slower. If that's what you're looking for, then fast away, my dudes.
Yeah, and maybe stop listening to this podcast.
Unless you're hate listening.
So, aid station quesadillas.
Yeah, what do you think? Have you ever had an aid station quesadilla? Intermittent aid station. The first aid station quesadilla I ever had, I wasn't running a race, but I was covering the Run Rabbit 100 for Trail Runner, and I ran into the Dry Lake aid station, and the speed goat himself was there making quesadillas, and he offered me one. So the first time I ever ate an aid station quesadilla, it was prepared for me special by Carl Meltzer.
Wow. Carl.
That's
OG.
The only time I've had an aid station quesadilla. I love quesadillas. I love cheese. I love hot, melty cheese.
I love hot cheese with what was that concoction you had?
That was
chocolate
cold cheese. That was cold cheese.
I am not hot on aid station quesadillas. Here's why. It's a lot of fat.
Fat and protein.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we want to, again, like, it really depends on how fast you're trying to run things. But so like if you're just like fully like adventure pacing, there could be some benefit to just a little something in your stomach. I
Yeah.
always want athletes to minimize their protein intake. You don't want to exceed 8 to 10 grams of protein per hour during exercise.
That's a lot.
And yeah, just make sure you practice with these things. I would never like whole cloth recommend an aid station quesadilla.
Yeah, maybe 12, 16 hours into the Hard Rock 100.
Yes, yeah,
you
but
know?
like if you're doing hard rock, like then yeah, it's gonna be a pierogathon.
Right. Understand the context in which you're racing and the energy systems you're using and use that to make good decisions about what fuel you're eating. I don't think like blindly eating quesadillas is
I don't think blindly eating anything is ever a great call.
But we know, we coach hundreds of
However,
people.
yeah, if I had a dime.
These things do happen with folks who are a little newer to the sport.
Correct.
So, yeah.
What's the craziest thing you've had someone eat during a race?
I feel like, it's got to be like that UTMB, like cured meats.
Oh, yeah, cured
just like
meats.
sitting out in the hot sun under like a warm...
Hot meat.
Yeah.
Hot French meat.
That
was almost going to be the name of this podcast, by the way.
Hot meat.
Hot French meat.
Hot French meat.
Yeah.
French aid station.
How do you say meat? Charcuterie chaude.
Oh. No, thank you. I
No,
mean,
merci.
they have more meat options.
So many different meats than
like,
electrolyte options.
Yeah, than gels, than chips, than
Yeah.
cookies. I don't know. Any of the things
It's
that
different.
actually
It's a
have
different culture.
carbohydrates. All right, we digress.
We digress. And once again, we've just started talking about aid station meat. So welcome to our podcast. So this question comes to us from an athlete that I thought would be really interesting to talk about, because not only does it, I think, have takeaways for athletes of all levels, but we do get a lot of new athletes who reach out. So when I say new, I'm not necessarily mean someone who's like, I've never run a step before in my life and I'd like to get started. I'm thinking of someone who has never followed a training program before.
Yeah, maybe for at least 1 or 2 years.
Yeah. So the question is, what should new ultrarunners expect to accomplish in their first 2 years of training?
Tons.
Yeah. Actually, this is one of the reasons I really love working with newer athletes, is because they progress so fast relative to more highly trained athletes. Essentially, especially if you have someone who's like, if they've been running somewhat health, or even if they haven't been running healthfully, usually if you just bring some amount of intention and strategy to their training program, you can help dig them out of an injury cycle usually pretty effectively. And because they haven't been training strategically, introducing almost any sort of change in stimulus and consistency will make them so much better so fast.
I think like before maybe getting into some of the stuff in this outline, I think there's a few things that athletes can honestly expect from their first few years of training, especially if you're working with the coach. One, I can see easy pace per mile dropping fairly significantly.
Correct.
I can also see output levels on in any range of effort levels and workouts improving. But particularly like if you've got a good coach who's got a balanced training approach, who's working with micro and macro cycles, you should be able to really improve like your ceiling. You should definitely be able to improve like the overall like effort you can do on tempo runs. And I think you should be able to put yourself in a position after 2 years of solid training to really be able to start reaching towards your bigger goals. And so like I believe like an athlete in this situation is going to become much more durable. They're going to start to have some of those structural adaptations come in where they they feel like they can recover better between workouts. They're not getting injured as much. There's less niggles.
Yeah.
And I think also just from a mental performance perspective, these athletes that have been, working through the process are going to feel a lot more competent, and that they have more like a significantly improved sense of expertise as well.
And so, again, most people who are wanting to run their first ultra have some background in running, but I really think it's important to shout out that ultra running is different than just running longer. And a big caveat here is that athletes need to base their racing goals on their available time now. Don't assume you're going to have more time or a less crazy life in the future. That has like never once happened. So you need to really be realistic about the time that you have available for training and recovery, right? Recovery is part of training. If you only have so much time available to train, you need to have similar bandwidth available for recovery.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
that like, you note something here that's really important that I've actually never thought about in these terms, but it may help athletes to see the bigger picture, that it's way better to be super prepared for a 50K than overwhelmed trying to prepare for a 50 miler.
Correct.
The amount of stress that goes into a 50 miler, considerably more than a 50K. I would much rather see an athlete, especially who's within those first couple of years of training with the coach and really still getting used to those larger cycles in training over years. I'd rather see them like work towards mastery at that 50K and really get good at racing that distance and feeling more comfortable at it before stepping up. Because the 50 miler, yeah, there's, some training similarities between 50K and 50 miles. Like, honestly, like the prescriptions probably aren't that different, but the distance is vastly different. And so it asks more from athletes, and you're going to be needing, in the peak weeks of training for a 50K versus a 50 miler, you're going to be going longer.
Yeah.
You need to build up the competence to be able to do that. And, being overwhelmed, trying to figure it all out isn't really a great state to be in going for that.
It's
50.
not a productive state. Like, yes, there will be some moments during any training cycle where it feels a little reachy, but if it feels real reachy every single day, that likely means that your goal is inappropriate given your current resources and bandwidth. But every step that you take today towards building up your base and building up those resources and bandwidth, the easier it'll be to really reach for that goal down the road. So let's talk about minimum training times.
Yeah.
We have sort of like a baseline for how much time you should expect to put in if this is your first year of like really training for an ultra. If you consistently have 6 to 8 hours a week for training, a 50K is great. And you can aim to do maybe 1 to even 3 a year on the upper end. Everyone's recovery is different. Everyone's life stresses are different. Everyone's resources are different. I never am like, yeah, definitely do 3 a year. Let's go in your first year. But we also don't need like 2 years to recover from running a 50K.
No.
And remember that lifestyle stresses will affect your recovery needs. If you have 8 to 12 hours available per week and manageable stress, you can aim for an 8 to 16 hour event like a 50 miler or a 100K within a year of ultramarathon training. But event selection is still important. That's sort of where maybe a hard rock qualifier not going to be a thing, or like a hard rocker style event not going to be a thing for you, but maybe a flatter, faster race that doesn't have crazy environmental conditions, not at a crazy altitude would be really helpful. As for running a 100, it is technically possible, but I really discourage athletes from trying to pursue that in their first year of training.
I discourage it in the second year as well. I say, why not? Why be so myopic and focused on that 100 when you could really be improving the systems?
Well, I'm just thinking, you're thinking from optimal. I think like,
is there
definitely
any other
2 years
choice?
is optimal. Well, no, I'm thinking like a lot of people really are like, I want to train for a 100. I really think you need more than a year of training to do that.
I think,
but I don't think you
timelines.
absolutely have to have 2. Again, I think it's definitely preferred.
Oh.
I would love to work with athletes who give themselves a longer runway, by the way. But like, in terms of just like the bare minimum of what you need to do, I think in over a year you can get there. But I would not recommend it in under a year. So I do not think that it is realistic to run a 100 miler in your first year of training.
No.
But here's how to improve your chances of success. Give yourself a longer runway. Time is your number one ally in this process. Give yourself space to develop gradually. Train consistently. Avoid long periods of missing training. Don't take a ski season away from running. Don't decide to, race unbound gravel and take a month off of running to focus on cycling. I think it's really important in this process that athletes track their training. Ideally, you're working with a coach like us. But even if you're not being guided by a professional, you need to be accountable in your training, and you need to be able to assess what works and what doesn't. And when you come to the conclusion that you have no idea because you have no certifications in training in this industry, hi, we're here for you.
I recommend athletes use something like Training Peaks.
Yeah.
Maybe Strava at
Strava
a
could be
minimum
good.
to track, just so you don't have to be accountable to the accounting of like all the numbers week by week.
Yeah.
I used to try to track in like a handwritten journal, and
Yeah.
it just becomes like laborious. And then, you know, you end up like not really seeing the bigger picture. And not tracking some of this stuff week to week in a way
this is
that's
something
like helpful.
I see when I onboard new athletes not infrequently is I'll say, oh, what has your average weekly mileage been? And they'll be like, oh yeah, you know, it's been like 30 miles a week, no problem. And then I'll actually look at their Strava and I'm like, well, it was 30 miles one week, and then it was 10, and then it was 50, and then it was 5. Like,
Right.
That's not, you know, the truth is not really there in the 30-mile-a-week average. And a lot of times people, I think, idealize their training when they don't have accountability, and they'll round up favorably. Self-reported data is typically pretty poor data.
So athletes can expect, I think they can expect a lot in their first couple of years of training.
You can expect a lot, but you can't expect to run a 100.
I'm going to go on the record and say, don't race 100 until you've at least got 2 years of training under your belt. That's just my personal opinion. That might be too hot for Coach Zoe.
No, I mean, that's also my opinion, but I don't think that we have the data to say that definitely don't do that.
I don't think you can.
I don't think it's optimal. I think you definitely can. I would not recommend it. It is not my preference. That is like an athlete archetype that I don't super duper resonate with is the couch to 100 miler.
I agree. And I've just seen too many burnouts as a result of that.
Like, lo and behold, even if you do get someone across the finish line healthy, like 9 times out of 10, we had to do such heroic training to get them there. They feel like they had to, like, the longer you train, it feels like the less you have to sacrifice.
Right.
You know? Because I've been training consistently for years. If I miss a Saturday because I need to go to a wedding or something, it's not like a huge deal because I have so many other Saturdays to back that up. But if you only give yourself 12 Saturdays, yeah, missing one of those Saturdays is a big fucking deal. So give yourself all the Saturdays possible. Give yourself a really long runway.
Yeah.
That way you can train joyfully. That way you can train intelligently. That way you can train without feeling like you have to like give your entire life over to the process. I feel like that's sort of the counterintuitive principle at play here is like the more time you put into it, the less time you have to put into it.
So we're going to talk about, we're not really talking about hill strides. We're talking about VO2 max work, which hill strides are kind of different than that.
Sure.
But when we're working with, like when you're working with a new athlete and they're in their first year, maybe they're in their second year.
New to structured training.
Yeah, new to structured training, maybe also new to running.
Yeah.
As part of that. Kudos to you if you're a new runner who reaches out for coaching right away.
Yeah, shout out to you. You're gonna have you're smart. Congratulations.
Good way to set yourself
Let me
up
know
for
what
success.
that's like.
Yeah, that was not my experience.
No. I feel like so many people like need to have like a ton of really shit days before they're like, I need a coach.
And that's okay. That's part of the learning process.
That was my process.
But like with those athletes, how much are you focusing on VO2 max work, working on keeping their ceiling high, those top end energy systems? What does that look like? Why would we want to do that? Let me just give you all the questions up front, and then you can
Great,
lecture
let me
us
talk
about
at
it.
you for 20 minutes. No. So what I really want to talk about today is a really interesting study that was published in February of 2023, looking at increased oxygen uptake in well-trained runners during uphill high-intensity running intervals, a randomized crossover testing. I really like this study because it was almost equally gender split, which is very helpful and we love to see. And it's also testing this intervention on well-trained trail runners. so often we'll see a study like this testing on like previously untrained runners, and I feel like
Right.
that isn't as applicable to what we're doing as like there can be general fitness takeaways from those studies, but for us, we really want to know what interventions are high impact for people who are already training, right? For people who are already doing something, we need to know what another something is that will make that time more effective.
Sure.
So let's back up and talk about what VO2 max is. VO2 max, or maximal oxygen consumption, is the maximum amount of oxygen a person can use during intense exercise. So you might be asking, wait, why are we talking about this for ultras, right? I'm running 12-minute pace. Like, does this even matter? And the answer is yes. On average, runners are operating at about 60% of their VO2 max during an ultra. There's lots of variability, but that effort is really moderate, right?
Yeah.
So why should
Pushing
ultra
towards
runners...
the easier side of moderate.
Right, yeah, 60%. So why should ultra runners work to train that? Simply put, if you're running at 60% of your max aerobic capacity, if you make your max aerobic capacity greater, then your 60% is greater as well. So I think that's why it's a really important adaptation to continue to target throughout a runner's progress.
I like to use like the kind of analogy of like having a glass.
Yeah.
And if like the top of the glass represents where your ceiling is, and the bottom of the glass kind of represents like your floor.
Yeah.
You can't raise your floor past your ceiling.
Right.
So you need to create a bigger glass if you want to get better. And that include, in order to raise the floor, you have to have a higher ceiling.
Yeah. And 60% of really good isn't as good as 60% of fucking awesome, which is kind of the goal with this. So let's talk about the physiological adaptations that we need to take place to increase VO2 max. So we're talking about cardiac adaptations like increased stroke volume. We're talking about oxygen carrying capacity and increased hemoglobin. We're talking, so adaptations on the muscle level that we're talking about are the increased number and size of mitochondria, making them more efficient at processing fat and carbohydrate into usable energy.
It's interesting to me how much of this actually impacts running at an easy effort.
Yeah, exactly. It's like trickle down fitness, but it actually works, right? So it's like Reaganomics, but for your butt, and it is backed up by evidence.
And I can't wait to mention the caveats to that, which is like, why can't we train all the time at VO2 max? It does make us inefficient. It makes us less able to metabolize fats, and it's risky to injury.
Yes, correct. So your cardiovascular system adapts to increase the oxygen carrying capacity and expand the network of capillaries moving blood through your muscle tissue. The bottom line is that improving your maximum aerobic capacity will make you more capable of moving blood through your muscles at every level of intensity, which is something we want. So in general, when you look at a lot of the research, ultra runners and trail runners tend to have really solid lactate threshold, but underdeveloped VO2 maxes because they're spending huge, like long, slow, like LSD days, long, slow distance days. So for a lot of us, and I think like I would fall into this category, VO2 max might be a weakness that we should continue to work on. And here I want to debunk a myth that we see on the internet all the time. So you might have heard or seen online that you only need to train in zones 1 or 2 for ultras. But a lot of the nuance that gets lost in there is that, yes, years of very high volumes of zone 1 to 2 training will over time raise your VO2 max. That is absolutely true. But that requires years of consistent high volume training to achieve what you could achieve in less time and in less effort.
Yeah, 4 to 6 weeks, really.
Yeah. So for anyone who wants to improve sport-specific performance, directly targeting VO2 max is a huge win.
So
TJ, can you tell me what a VO2 max interval looks like? What does it look like in the wild? And when do you prescribe them?
Yeah, let's just slow this down a second. That was a lot of information, and I think that
I like hit my VO2 max output.
You've reached the ceiling. Now let's just bring it down to that easy zone 2, and just maybe set this in terms of like how this actually shows up for athletes in training. I think really the best way to do this is to, one, get yourself a hill. 6 to 8% grade is ideal because...
Well, we're actually going to get into what the study says about that later.
Really?
Yeah.
Steeper.
It can be, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay. I'm interested to hear more about that. I like 6 to 8% because and with a little wiggle room on either end.
Oh,
because,
tons of wiggle room.
Well, it's enough to decrease the risk for injury.
Yeah.
It's enough to feel the like kind of the weight of gravity holding you back and to create the resistance forces you need to raise your heart rate much faster than if you're running on flatter ground. And it's also it's not so steep that it creates the sensation where you have to bound, which is where I draw a big limit for athletes over time, because if the hill is too steep, we run with a different form.
Yeah.
And at all stages of this process, no matter what energy system you're looking to work on, running with really good form is important for overall development for an athlete. You want to be practicing the proper biomechanics. You want to be using their neural pathways that are going to lead to the most efficient running over time. A really inefficient runner with the high VO2 max is, still going to be probably a pretty inefficient, not great performing runner. So hills that are too steep, they're going to get you out of that form. So 6 to 8% grade is a general good rule of thumb. And the way that these look is like hard, very hard intervals, maximal, 10 out of 10 effort, with equal recovery periods.
Yeah.
So
or more.
Yeah, you could do more, maybe depending on the athlete's level. But I think in general, for a well-trained athlete, what I've seen in practice is really
and I would actually say anyone on a
time.
microcosm training plan is well trained, just to level set. If you're an athlete that's listening and you're like, am I well trained? Yes, welcome. Pat yourself on the back.
If you're one of my athletes, you're probably going to get the 1-to-1 ratio, unless there's something something else in there where we want to maybe and keep the output levels higher for longer in that workout.
Correct. So VO2 max intervals are the hardest workouts that we prescribe, and they're the hardest workouts on most runners and certainly ultrarunners training schedule. And the goal here is to apply enough stress on the cardiovascular system to stimulate a response on the oxygen delivery and aerobic capacity. So going back to TJ's metaphor of the ceiling, if you want to push your ceiling higher, that means you need to push against your existing ceiling. So the goal becomes to accumulate time above 90% of current VO2 max. This is something that we've been doing for years for our athletes, but we were really stoked to sort of go through this study because, again, it looks at how when you combine VO2 max intervals and the hill stimulus, how that impacts well-trained runners, which is super relevant to the population that we work with. So again, why do we do these intervals on an uphill? To reduce ground reaction forces So the harder you run, the higher your ground reaction forces will be. Running fast is mechanically demanding, which theoretically increases your risk for injury. Uphill intervals will be slower, right? Like running uphill is a little harder than running flat. So that might also mitigate some of the injury risks associated with higher outputs. The second question I think is really, really interesting the study looks at is whether we can stress the cardiovascular system to elicit increases in VO2 max as effective or more effectively than we can on flat ground. One of the caveats in the study is it did not test ground reaction forces, but focused on cardio response in hills versus flat stride. So it's not looking at the injury effect here. So breaking the study down, there were 8 female and 9 male participants. We stand a almost gender equal study. They were mostly young, so the average age was 24 to 27 years old.
Pretty important because those athletes are going to still have a pretty high VO2 max.
Pretty high VO2 max and pretty low injury risk.
Yeah.
So that's a caveat there. But, this is, again, it was a really well-done study that had the athletes do their VO2 max intervals on an 8% grade treadmill versus a 1% grade treadmill, and it used a metabolic cart to really, truly measure oxygen uptake, total ventilation per minute, breathing frequency, tidal volume, along with heart rate, blood lactate, and RPE. So let's get into what this study found. Something I think can really get lost in translation here is that this is like a big principle of training, and one of the reasons that you should work with a coach and you should structure your training intentionally over time is that the ability to achieve the greatest adaptive, like what we want in training, is to achieve the greatest adaptive response while inducing as little training stress as possible. The best training is the most efficient training.
It's the least you can do.
Yeah, while still provoking the adaptations you want. Because every stress has to be balanced by adequate recovery time, and time is a finite resource. So training more than you need is fucking stupid. There is no point to that. You are like at a certain, like you approach a threshold of like, okay, my training is productive, and then maybe there's no such thing as like neutral training, because you could be using that time to recover, which would render your training more productive. So this is like one of the things we always want to be really careful in balancing with our athletes is like, how do we train, like give you the most training or like the least training that we need to give you to get you to where you need to go.
Yeah, to provoke the biggest
to provoke the
adaptation.
So efficiency, and not just throwing a bunch of shitty miles and work at people. Every stress needs to be balanced. You want, to quote the study, you want the biggest bang for your buck, not just a big bang. The goal of training isn't to just add a shit ton of load to an athlete's calendar, even though I feel like that, is the goal of the current news cycle. What separates quality training from crap training is the discernment to only use as much stimulus as is necessary to maximize targeted stresses to elicit the desired adaptation.
So what does
and
this
is
mean?
why the study is so important.
What happens in the study?
So in the study, researchers found that athletes reach a higher percentage of their VO2 max, exceed 90% of VO2 max sooner, and were able to accumulate more time in the zone above 90% of VO2 max compared to the exact same workout on level ground.
Just intuitively,
yes,
makes
right? Yeah.
a lot of sense.
So you're
right?
like, wait, this study concluded running hills is hard? Like, no duh, scientists. But yes, this is one of the reasons that can be so impactful to do intervals on the uphill is for many athletes, they may not have the mechanical efficiency to like actually access that 90% of their VO2 max.
It's
right?
hard.
It is.
You have
It's
to
really
be able
hard
to
to
go
run that hard.
So fast.
Right. But you don't have to run that fast uphill for it to be fucking hard. So prescribing these intervals on an uphill is actually going to be more effective at helping athletes access that productive load.
Yeah, absolutely. So can we overdo it on these?
Yes, you can absolutely overdo it on hill training. And there's some drawbacks to that. Running hard uphill places higher stress on your lower limbs, especially the Achilles tendon. And you have to remember that what goes up must come down, unless you're doing this on a treadmill, which is like, that's a really adequate, like you can definitely do uphill VO2 max intervals on the treadmill. All of that's great, but what goes up usually must come down. Although, like if you're training for a trail race, and ultra particularly one with a lot of climbing, it's important to get your legs ready for the rigors of downhill running. Downhill running causes more muscle soreness and more muscle damage than running on flat or undulating terrain. So we always want to be really, really careful about that stimulus and not adding it in where it's not productive. If all of your workouts are hill workouts, you might be doing more harm, just more harm than good because of all the downhills you're running. And uphill condition the researchers found this condition isn't necessary to achieve the target intensity for aerobic and lactate threshold intervals, so you can just do those flat.
Totally, and I think mixing it up is going to help you stay more efficient because as we mentioned before, really steep grades, you're going to use less of your normal running form, and if you repeat that over time, that makes you less efficient.
Correct. The point of the study isn't drop everything and make sure you do all of your workouts uphill. It's, hey, uphill VO2 max workouts are a great tool to have in your tool belt because they might reduce injury risk and they certainly help you access 90% of your VO2 max more effectively than training on flat ground. And again, we're always like, it's a delicate dance between balancing stress and injury risk and positive adaptation. So here, I think the study really adequately shows how well uphill intervals achieve that. Another note is that the grade that you do these on matters. This study used that 8% graded hill on the treadmill. Previous research shows that energetics increase linearly with increased grade up till about 15%. Ergo, there is no such thing as too steep as long as you really are running. So in practical terms, what that means is you want to hit somewhere between a 4% grade and a 12% grade in your workouts, but nothing magic happens at 3% or 13% that renders those workouts ineffective. It's going to be really individually variable. It's just that in that range, athletes can achieve a more balanced combo of speed and intensity that's still high quality.
It's a really big range.
It's a really big range, but again, if you find yourself bounding, dial it down. I just don't need you to go like full Strava psycho and have to be like sometimes I'll have athletes send me a Strava like segment and they're like, well, the lower part of this hill is 4% and then the upper part is 7.5. Can I do a interval there? And I'm like, yes, it's fine.
Absolutely. Is it long enough for you to do 3 to 5 minutes as hard as you can?
And like if there's like a little flat section, that's fine, right? Like again, the goal is to launch you into 90% of your VO2 max.
Oh God. So painful just to think about.
Yeah. Something we want to think about also is to never run strides or intervals downhill. That's all risk, no reward. Energetically, you're not getting the adaptations you need, and you're just pounding your body without getting much fitter. Usually the amount of downhill running that we can do through normal training is enough to get stimulus. But again, like we do intervals to build fitness, not to just like make our muscles and bones more durable, which is usually the adaptations we want through downhill training as experienced through just the course of normal running.
I'd love to talk just a little bit about how, VO2 max training might fit into a year-long training cycle for an athlete.
Yeah. So, this is something I'd love to hear you chat about, but one of the big principles that we work with is you train more specific energy systems closer to the race. So if you're running an ultra marathon, we're likely going to be doing longer format intervals and threshold work closer to that event because those energy systems are more specific to that event. So what that means we'll likely be training VO2 max further out from that event because it's less specific. How do you like to structure VO2 max training in your programming?
Yeah, I mean, I'll use the perfect example, which is my athletes who are on multi-year cycles.
Right.
So are coming off of a running season that typically maybe ends in October, November, or very early December, and incorporates some kind of a transition season where there's a few weeks with more cross training, a little bit of detraining naturally occurs there. There's a little less running, but there's not no running. It's just really that like mental refresh kind of part of the year. And then I usually start to gradually build athletes back after that. And that starts with the base building phase of training, which has a lot of strides and a lot of hills, usually 20-second intervals to keep speed high, work on biomechanics, work on fundamentals, and we'll do some like shorter, faster workouts as well as that athlete progresses along that build. That's usually like an 8 to 12 week period. So the athlete gets a lot of volume in, intensity, like in terms of time at intensity, it's much lower because the volume's higher, but we're not ignoring keeping up with like good technique, like good leg speed, good knee drive, making sure we feel light and fast. Essentially with those workouts, we're setting the stage to be able to handle really pushing the ceiling up over a 4 to 6 week period after that.
Yeah.
And that's when, before the ultra season begins, far out from that, a race, that's when we really start to push up the ceiling. And I think for most athletes, the type of workouts and stuff look different. I don't, stick to any one specific like formula on this.
Like one by ones?
But, well, you see, like 1 by 1 on a hill, I don't think is enough time for an athlete who's been a few years involved in this process to really like start to get to over 90% of their overall capacity to be in that VO2 max range. So for athletes, this looks like, 1 to 3 minute long intervals at a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, 12 to 24 minutes of overall time at intensity, 4 to 6 weeks of training. Depends on the athlete. Newer athletes going to do less. Athletes who have been more involved in the process for longer might be able to do more like 6 weeks. And it also depends, like more advanced athletes might do they might do 2 sessions like this a week, I've seen. So variety of different circumstances in which you'd use this, but I think the framework for this really remains the same. Further out from a race, setting the stage for then working on those other systems later in the year.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that advanced athletes continue to work on your speed through VO2 max intervals. New athletes work on that speed through VO2 max intervals. Hills are a great way of making sure you're able to access your VO2 max more effectively while reducing the impact forces and therefore your risk of injury.
Sweet. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.